Okay, we'll take a moment or two to follow up on one or two of the issues that have come up in the presentations, and then hopefully we'll hear from you in the audience as well. It's almost impossible to see here, so we'll be looking strangely at you as you ask your questions, I think. There's one thing I'd like to kick off with, and then maybe with Grant and Catalina have issues they'd like to raise about each other's presentations. I suppose the thing that comes to mind for me in response to Catalina, your presentation, is the particular way in which you've situated your practice in relation to Latin American theory and philosophy, and the way in which you mentioned the situated notion of the coloniality of power. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, maybe in a moment coming to you, Grant, but maybe first begin with you, Catalina, could you maybe say a little more about the particularity of that approach to post-colonial theory, or post-colonial practice perhaps, mm-hmm. as distinct from how that might be articulated or formulated within, say, the European Academy?
So as I said, Aníbal Quijano coined the term coloniality of power, and from that moment on, several Latin American scholars have been developing this idea. And there is a group in Berkeley, in the University of California in Berkeley, called Coloniality/Modernity, because they claim that there could not be modernity without coloniality, so that modernity was possible to develop thanks to the colonization of the Americas first and then other parts of the world. So that's why I also said that I kind of work against the grain of considering modernity a European construct. I think it's a sort of, it's like Emanuel Wallerstein defines it as a world system. So that's one of the things that I think inform my work. On the other hand, the notion of coloniality describes a situation that is perhaps very specific to Latin America, which is the continuation of colonial structures after the independence. Specifically social structures that were very much based on race, or on the invention of the notion of race, which is a European invention. So labor was organized according to this classification, social classification. And I think that kind of continues to be almost untouched in many cases. Probably the case of Bolivia is a very important exception, but in general it's quite clear that those structures continue to function quite well. So it describes a situation that is very particular to Latin America, but also they have kind of worked a lot on the notion of Eurocentrism and criticism of Eurocentrism, which is something that I think they share with other post-colonial theorists from other places. And I think my work as a curator is also very informed by that criticism of Eurocentrism. So for instance, a few years ago I curated a show that, I mean, I'm always a bit wary of saying this, but just to kind of put it in a nutshell, it was about internal colonialism in Europe and social, economic, and cultural practices that are identified as forms of internal colonialism that then functioned very well in the colonies overseas.
And certain aspects of that would undoubtedly be relevant in the Irish context, I imagine. And Grant, the place that you speak from and work from is quite different in the sense, I suppose, the obvious sense that you're based in London and developing work which has relations to India and to Indian art history and so on. And can you say a little bit about the sort of, how you position yourself or reflect on your own position within this discourse and this practice.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it has been a complicated position. It's been one that's evolved over the years. What I was very inspired by, in fact, was recently reading a book by Leela Gandhi, who's a post-colonial theorist who's also based in the States, of Indian origin. And she talked about, she made this very interesting research into anti-colonial movements, but her focus was on collaborations between people in the metropolis who, coming from very specific subject positions to do with sexuality, to do with gender, to do with sometimes spirituality, vegetarianism, so found themselves caught up in the fight for independence in India. So, I mean, I'm saying that's a kind of political ideal in a way, that one can collaborate in a process. Also, I suppose what I would say is that the project has been about a series of collaborations. So, my knowledge of Chanton and Caoimhín, for example, comes very substantially from conversations I've had with the art historian Anshuman Dasgupta. So my first encounter with the sculpture was through a conversation with him, where he described to me all of these different elements, its meaning in terms of the representation of this indigenous group, it's the way that it synthesizes different kind of art historical streams into one work. And so maybe that, I don't know if that
it does, yeah.
Some way to...
Yeah, no, and it was to think about the benefits and the anxieties of those collaborative relationships, what it means and what hierarchies there might be, or implicit or explicit.
I think they're constantly changing. I mean, I think power is quite a complex thing, and again, hierarchies are continuously changing. It's a very different relationship I have, for example, with working with an artist like Sheila Gowda, where she, you know, we're making an exhibition together, but she is very substantially involved in the representation of her own work, and my role is very much a supporting role. Whereas something like Santal Family, I mean, I made a proposition which involved a certain amount of risk, but it also was one that was an invitation to people to come and explore this notion that a work from 1938 that has a very significant position in Indian art history can also be something relevant beyond that art history. So I think in terms of power relations, I think it's something which is permanently shifting. It's something which I guess for me is really the main thing, is to be vigilant and aware of these power relations, which I think is the case for everybody in this situation.
I'm not sure how much time we have, so just a few minutes. So I think maybe we will take the opportunity to hear from the floor if we can. I can certainly see one hand up over here, and maybe if anyone else wants to speak, yeah, put your hand really, really high.
Hi, I'd just like to ask Catalina, we have heard about activists being murdered in Latin American countries over the dams and that, and I'm just wondering, how is it for artists who are trying to deal with these issues within their work, and within a system, as you said, that is still the structures of colonialism is still there. How do the artists get funding if they're seen to be doing that type of work?
Well, I have to say that many times the interest comes from abroad. So Carolina lives between Colombia and Los Angeles, and she has had a few grants from the United States foundations. In a way, working in these contexts doesn't require necessarily that much funding as will. the real like involvement is free, let's say. So the production of images is what becomes more expensive, and I guess that's what turns the project into art. I would say in Colombia, art is not considered as a dangerous practice, so she's not facing sort of repression. But the people that are struggling against these dams are. So in a way, whether an artist can or cannot impact the results of this activism, for me is uncertain, but I think from her point of view, or from her role as an artist, I think the fact that she is producing work that visualizes in different ways some of the consequences of these mega infrastructural projects is kind of very relevant. But I would say, yeah, I mean, I already said that. It's not a matter of so much funding as of being able to really engage with these communities.
Does that question have a bearing on your practice?
Which part of it?
I suppose the ways in which, you know, artists' practices in places that, you know, in parts of India that you've worked with, whether they're dissident practices in some way, is there an issue of how they get funded and supported and so on?
Yeah, I think that perhaps it's similar in the sense that some funding does come from outside of India, so, you know, Ford Foundation, HEVOS, these international funds that if you are making an experimental practice or you want to set up an institution like, for example, Sarai or something like that, that it might be that, I mean, that's of course partly funded by the university, but it might be that you also have to bring in money from outside sources. Of course, there's a very strong commercial scene there, which is supporting the work of artists in a different way. But I think when it comes to these more experimental, politicized practice, then it's a more complicated situation.
Maybe we could take a Koyo.
I have one question for Catalina, which maybe also Grant can pitch into indirectly, about the notion of assimilation, and which is something that I've been looking at and also discussing within the context of the exhibition in a certain way, and which I think that sort of resonates in the context of Latin America, particularly, even more so when you were saying earlier that the structures of colonialism, even after the independencies of the early 19th century throughout Latin America, are still in place. So, I mean, the idea of a look at it in a comparative way, I mean, the colonial system in Africa or in Southeast Asia or in India for the matter, and in Latin America and in Ireland, where we are starting from, have very different histories. And what I would like you to maybe say a few words about the process of assimilation and also the process of social and cultural mixing that took place in Latin American countries, whereas the very idea of liberation from womb and by womb, and the very idea of decolonization becomes extremely difficult to disentangle, because perpetrators became local, so to speak. You know, so that would be interesting to maybe say something about that.
Yes, I think, as you say, the independence didn't mean decolonization at all. The process of decolonization still needs to happen, I guess. So actually in context like Argentina, it was after independence from the Spanish rule that most of the extermination of indigenous people happened by the sort of new leaders of those territories. So the criollo ideology is pretty much the Spanish ideology that was completely kind of embedded in the institutions that were born after independence. And I think it's until very recently, the past probably 50 years, that more and more artists and thinkers have been able to have some visibility questioning this state of affairs. The light is really very strong. And I think through education, I mean, the educational system has kind of promoted this idea that Spanish colonization was sort of a good thing, and the loss of lives is never really mentioned when you're in high school in Latin America, or the loss of African and indigenous lives is never mentioned. That the literature around the ending of slavery is almost like celebratory, as like congratulating yourself of something good that you did, when the history of slavery is never really studied in depth. Of course, there are many scholars that have unpacked all these histories and tried to question the sort of status quo of ideological assimilation, as you say. And I think now there are many artists that are becoming more and more aware of the need to tackle these issues from different perspectives, not from the sort of epistemological regime of Eurocentrism, which is what's been very much dominant until now. In Colombia in 1991 there was a new constitution that granted rights to indigenous communities and African Colombian communities, and it's regarded as a very sort of progressive constitution for the region, but it has never been really implemented. So I think the work has to go a lot further than the law, and it has to be kind of I mean, the decolonization has to go a lot further. So I think indigenous movements in Colombia, at least, are one of the most progressive and active social movements, proposing really sensible changes in society that are just, I think we would all agree with, but they seem to be really against other agendas.
And this must be, of course, relevant in the Indian context as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that going back to this question of institutions that are sort of bequeathed by the colonizer, I think what's interesting about the example of the art school that Tagore set up was that it was very much an attempt to, I think, break out of this binary in a way and to bypass the British in terms of art education, and to look to a European avant-garde on the one hand, but also to think, to produce a form of cosmopolitanism that was also strongly linked to other Asian cultures. So, as I mentioned in the talk, there was this trip by Tagore to Japan. There were many artists that went to Japan from Kalabavan and vice versa. You know, I think that was one thing. I think in terms of internal colonialism, there's also an interesting story in relation to the Santal tribal indigenous people, in the sense that their uprising in 1855 was also against high caste Indian landlords. So it was an indigenous uprising against all forms of oppression, which I think complicates the story a little bit.
We have a question up here. Sorry, Declan, I know you can't see me.
That's okay. Koyo, I think just have one quick comment following up, and then we'll come to the question.
No, I just wanted to
Ask Catalina, you mentioned an exception of Bolivia. Maybe everybody is not really aware what is the Bolivian exception,
Okay,
you know,
so
in that context.
So
What happened in Bolivia that didn't happen in Colombia or in Brazil or in Venezuela?
I guess Bolivia is a special case because it's one of the few countries in South America where most of the population is still indigenous. Until, I don't know how long Evo Morales has been in power, but maybe 10 years now or a bit longer. So until maybe 10, 12 years ago, they had been governed by the white minority. And about 10 years ago, an indigenous president came into power, which it is an exception for the region, that there is someone that is not white ruling a country. The other example that I've heard also is Chavez in Venezuela. But I would say Evo Morales has really tried to implement some non-Western ideas of representation, democracy, and use of natural resources that Chavez wasn't able to really even think about, because I think he was sort of thinking in different terms. So that is an exception, and it is also, I mean, I hear many different opinions about Bolivia, and some people say Evo Morales favors the sort of Aymara indigenous people rather than other indigenous nations that live in Bolivia. But I think those criticisms are not really productive in terms of looking at the bigger picture of Latin America and the fact that Bolivia is probably one of the countries that is achieving some level of decolonization at this point.
We'll take the question up there and then...
Hi, yeah, thank you. I just have a question for Catalina to ask you maybe to say something a little bit more about something that I think makes a really interesting contribution to thinking about decolonization and artists' strategies of intervention in terms of reframing the problem of the colonizer and the colonized in a kind of binary sort of framework. And that's, you spoke about the denial of the coeval of the colonizer and the colonized. And I'm just wondering if I understand you correctly, that you're speaking about this idea that the colonizer, we have a narrative where the colonizer obstructs the colonized access to representation in the present, so that they're forced to live in the past, but particularly forced to live in the past in a way that sort of represents or reconstructs it based on an ideology of a pre-existence, a kind of pre-state of being before being colonized. And this narrative then implicates both the colonizer and the colonized in what you kind of seem to speak about, that I think is really interesting, somehow not being able to get out of the bind with capitalism and its progress, that somehow uses this sort of surplus, what is left over from the denial of the coeval, and the categorization, hierarchical sort of framework of the colonizer and colonized, and that implicates both in sort of capitalism and its progress, and that that perhaps
probably quite a lot in that.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. Okay.
And maybe a response from both of you, and then maybe we could wrap up. Yeah.
Well, I think you've kind of said it all. I don't know what to add to the question. I think precisely the idea of, the denial of coevalness, as Mignolo calls it, is this idea that the colonized, or even like rural communities or people that are not living at the heart of capitalism, live in the past, because capitalism is inevitable, so they're just behind. They're not catching up with capitalism. So basically I think it is obviously an ideological construct. It's not a factual reality. Is an ideological construct that is aimed at portraying the inevitability of capitalism as a motto for social development. But yeah, I think in your question you already kind of answered. Or
yeah, I think also it comes back to what you were saying about modernism. You know, there's different modernisms, and one of the things that Tagore said was that, I mean, one of the interesting things about moving this educational initiative into a rural setting, and part of it was the idea that for him modernism wasn't inextricably linked to European industrial capitalism, that it could have it could take a different form. And for him, he described it as being something which was a kind of freedom of mind in relation to tradition. So it's how do you relate to those traditions? But it absolutely, I think it's this idea that there were these many different forms of modernism that coexisted at the same time, and weren't, as you say, dependent on one particular model.
Maybe I would just like to add that also another consequence of this is that legally people have to prove their authenticity as, for instance, indigenous. And so having to do that means that you have to prove your traditions, and you have to prove your status as a sort of traditional indigenous people, which would imply that people, like indigenous people, don't have the right to change or to accommodate different practices and techniques into their daily lives, that they are kind of obliged to follow certain traditional, or what the West considers a traditional behavior, and therefore they're like stuck in time, literally. So I think Jimmy Durham has written a lot about this issue, and specifically in the Americas, I think it's quite a good reference to discuss that.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks Brian, thanks Catalina, and thanks.